They thought we'd just disappear quietly. 400 of us, fired overnight with nothing but a cold email. But 3 months later, we weren't begging for jobs. We were filing the $1.2 billion class action that would eventually bring the entire company to its knees. My name is Kendall Price, I'm 36 years old, and I gave 12 years of my life to a corporation that erased me in one night. What they didn't realize was that when you push people to the edge, they don't just fall. Sometimes, they push back hard enough to topple everything. The email hit my phone at exactly 2:13 in the morning, jolting me awake with its harsh blue glow. At first glance, it looked like spam with its sterile formatting and corporate letterhead, but then I saw my full name in the subject line and my stomach dropped like a stone. Position termination effective immediately, no greeting, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the 12 years I dedicated to climbing their corporate ladder. I read it 3 times before the reality sank in, my hands trembling as I held the device. When I arrived at the office that morning, hoping against hope it was some kind of mistake, security guards were already stationed at every entrance, escorting my former colleagues out with hastily packed cardboard boxes and defeated expressions. The whispers in the lobby confirmed my worst fears. 400 of us had been cut overnight in what they called a strategic restructuring, and absolutely no one had seen it coming. I stood there in the marble atrium I'd walked through thousands of times, watching my entire career get wiped out with the efficiency of a computer algorithm, and I realized that to them, we were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. By mid-morning, we had gathered outside the gleaming glass tower that had been our professional home for years, hundreds of us standing in stunned silence on the sidewalk with our belongings clutched in our arms. Some people were crying openly, others were shouting into their phones at recruiters and family members, while many just stared blankly at the building that had just rejected them like antibodies fighting an infection. My colleague Jonah, who had started the same week as me 12 years ago, kept repeating the same phrase over and over, 12 years, just gone like that. His voice cracked each time he said it, and I could see the shock and disbelief written across his face like a roadmap of betrayal. The most infuriating part was learning that our CEO was currently vacationing in the Maldives, celebrating what the company press release called a record-breaking quarter, built on the backs of the people he'd just discarded. Standing there in the shadow of corporate indifference, surrounded by my former colleagues who were now my fellow casualties, I felt something shift inside me, a cold, determined anger that would burn for months to come. That was the exact moment I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like someone with nothing left to lose. By noon, the news vans had arrived and our mass termination was the lead story on every business channel across the country. Fortune 500 company cuts 400 jobs overnight to boost quarterly profits, the headline screamed, reducing our collective devastation to a simple cost-cutting measure that would make shareholders happy. The CEO, speaking through a carefully crafted press statement from his luxury resort, called it a strategic restructuring necessary for long-term competitiveness in an evolving marketplace. To those of us standing outside with our careers in ruins, it felt like the ultimate betrayal, being erased not for performance issues or company struggles, but simply to pad the bottom line. I checked my email obsessively throughout the day, searching desperately for some additional communication that would explain severance packages, health insurance extensions, or transition assistance, but there was nothing except that original cold termination notice. The silence from the company was deafening and felt like a deliberate insult, as if they couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge our humanity after years of dedicated service. As I watched the news crews pack up their equipment and move on to the next story, I made a silent promise to myself that this wouldn't be the end of our story. That evening, about 30 of us crowded into Jonah's cramped apartment, sharing pizza and our growing sense of outrage at how we'd been treated like disposable equipment rather than human beings. People were throwing out ideas left and right, organizing protests outside headquarters, starting petition campaigns, even staging dramatic confrontations in the executive parking garage. But most suggestions felt more like therapy than actual strategy. The atmosphere was thick with anger, fear, and desperate brainstorming when Mia, a quiet payroll analyst who rarely spoke up in group settings, suddenly pulled out a thick manila folder that would change everything. Her hands were shaking slightly as she spread documents across Jonah's coffee table, and her voice was barely above a whisper when she said, "I've been keeping records of something illegal they've been doing for years, but I was terrified to speak up because I knew they'd fire me and blacklist me from the industry." The room fell silent as we gathered around to look at what she discovered through months of careful documentation and personal risk. Systematic wage theft, unpaid overtime that had been deliberately erased from records, and workers who had been illegally misclassified to avoid paying benefits and proper compensation. If what these documents showed was true, this wasn't just an unfair mass layoff. This was a pattern of deliberate fraud and exploitation that had been going on for years right under our noses. The documents that Mia had carefully compiled over months told a horrifying story of corporate greed that went far beyond what any of us had imagined. Pay stubs that showed bonuses being mysteriously adjusted downward after employees had earned them, overtime hours that vanished from time tracking systems before payday, and classification schemes that illegally labeled full-time employees as contractors to avoid providing health insurance and retirement benefits. The most damning evidence showed that the company had been systematically stealing from the very people they had just fired, creating a multi-million-dollar slush fund built on wage theft and benefits fraud. As we passed the documents around the room, examining signature after signature from executives who had authorized these illegal practices, the atmosphere shifted from despair to something much more dangerous, righteous fury. Someone in the back of the room voiced what we were all thinking: this isn't just unfair treatment, this is a federal crime, and we have the evidence to prove it. The idea of a class action lawsuit wasn't explicitly mentioned yet, but you could feel it crystallizing in the air around us as we realized we weren't just victims of corporate downsizing, we were witnesses to years of systematic criminal behavior. That night, scattered conversations about what we could do began turning into concrete discussions about what we were going to do. We spent the next week making frantic phone calls to employment lawyers, labor unions, investigative journalists, and anyone else who might be willing to listen to our story and help us figure out our next steps. Most of the attorneys we contacted were polite but dismissive, explaining that wrongful termination cases were expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful against large corporations with unlimited legal budgets. But one name kept coming up in every conversation we had with people who understood corporate litigation: Rachel Moreno, a fierce employment attorney who had built her reputation by taking on billion-dollar companies and winning settlements that made national headlines. When we finally managed to get a meeting with her in a cramped conference room downtown, she listened intently as we laid out our evidence and told our stories of systematic wage theft and illegal employment practices. After reviewing Mia's documents for what felt like hours, Rachel leaned back in her chair with the kind of smile that probably made corporate lawyers wake up in cold sweats, and delivered the words that would change our lives. "You don't just have a case here, you have a billion-dollar bomb that's been waiting to explode." My heart started pounding as I realized we might actually have the power to fight back against the company that had treated us like garbage and get away with it for years. Rachel's legal team moved with the efficiency of a military operation, collecting sworn statements, employment contracts, pay stubs, and time records from hundreds of current and former employees who had been victimized by the company's illegal practices. One by one, people came forward with increasingly damning testimony about overtime that had been erased, bonuses that had been stolen, and discriminatory promotion practices that had kept qualified employees trapped in lower-paying positions for years. Each new statement we collected painted a clearer picture of a company that had been systematically exploiting its workforce while presenting a pristine public image of corporate responsibility and employee satisfaction. But then Rachel's investigators uncovered something that took this case from serious to explosive: internal emails and board meeting minutes that proved the company's executive leadership and board of directors had known about these wage theft practices for years and had deliberately covered them up. This wasn't just negligence or mismanagement, this was conscious, deliberate criminal conspiracy that went all the way to the top of the corporate hierarchy. As the evidence piled up on Carmen's conference table, it became clear that we weren't just dealing with a few bad managers making poor decisions, but with a culture of corruption that had infected every level of the organization. Meanwhile, the company was desperately trying to control the narrative surrounding the mass layoffs with an expensive public relations campaign that made my stomach turn. Their glossy television commercials featured smiling employees talking about innovation and the future of work, while their press releases painted the firings as a bold strategic move that would make the company more competitive and agile. We watched these advertisements with growing disgust, knowing that the same executives who had authorized years of wage theft were now spending millions of dollars to make themselves look like visionary leaders instead of the criminals they actually were. But behind their polished public facade, internal documents that were being leaked to Rachel's team revealed a very different story. Executives were panicking about potential legal exposure, frantically deleting emails, and holding emergency meetings about damage control strategies. They knew that their years of illegal practices had left them vulnerable to exactly the kind of lawsuit we were preparing, but they had no idea how much evidence we had already assembled or how comprehensive our case was about to become. Every day brought new leaked documents showing their fear and desperation, which only fueled our determination to see this through to the bitter end. The deeper Rachel's investigators dug into the company's financial records and internal communications, the uglier and more criminal the picture became. Financial documents revealed that the CEO had awarded himself an $18 million bonus just 3 days before the mass layoffs, essentially celebrating his decision to destroy 400 lives by rewarding himself with money that should have gone to employee compensation. Board members had quietly sold millions of dollars worth of their stock holdings in the weeks leading up to the firings, suggesting they had advanced knowledge of the layoffs and had used that inside information for illegal insider trading. The puzzle pieces were forming a picture of a company that wasn't just morally bankrupt but was systematically violating federal securities laws, employment regulations, and basic human decency. Rachel's team found evidence of wage theft going back over 5 years, discriminatory hiring and promotion practices that violated civil rights laws, and a pattern of retaliation against employees who had tried to report illegal practices through official channels. Every new piece of evidence we uncovered made it clearer that this wasn't just about getting justice for the 400 of us who had been fired. This was about exposing and punishing a criminal enterprise that had been masquerading as a legitimate business. As I watched the mountain of evidence grow taller each day, I realized we weren't just fighting for compensation anymore. We were fighting to bring down an entire corrupt system. The lawsuit was filed on a Friday morning in federal court, and by noon it had exploded across every major news network in the country as the lead story. 400 fired workers file $1.2 billion class action against Fortune 500 giant, dominated headlines from coast to coast, and social media platforms were flooded with supportive comments from people who had experienced similar corporate abuse. The hashtag Justice for 400 started trending within hours, and former employees from years past began reaching out to share their own horror stories of wage theft, discrimination, and retaliation they had suffered at the same company. The stock price began sliding that very afternoon, dropping 12% by closing bell as investors started to panic about the massive legal and financial exposure the company was facing. Standing outside the courthouse after the filing, surrounded by news cameras and reporters shouting questions, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that terrible night when the termination email arrived: hope. For the first time in months, it felt like we had real power instead of just righteous anger, and watching the company's stock price plummet in real time felt like the first domino in what would hopefully become a complete collapse of the corrupt empire they had built on stolen wages and broken promises. The company's initial response to our lawsuit was exactly what we had expected from an organization that had spent years believing it was untouchable: pure arrogance mixed with legal intimidation tactics. Their army of expensive corporate lawyers held press conferences dismissing our claims as baseless accusations from disgruntled former employees seeking an undeserved payday, and they accused us of exaggerating our damages and fabricating evidence of wage theft. But then Rachel delivered her first devastating blow in court by presenting Exhibit 47, internal emails between executives that had been discovered during the evidence collection process, including one particularly damning message where the CFO had joked about bleeding the workers dry before we cut them loose like the parasites they are. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs as the judge read the email aloud, and even the company's own lawyers looked stunned by the callous cruelty of their clients' own words. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine fear flash across the CEO's face in news footage from outside the courthouse, and I knew with absolute certainty that we had them cornered. Their arrogance had finally become their weakness, and every cruel joke and dismissive comment they had made about us was now going to be used as evidence of their criminal conspiracy. The media attention surrounding our case grew more intense with each passing day, with reporters camping outside our homes and requesting exclusive interviews about our experiences of corporate abuse and systematic wage theft. Suddenly I found myself thrust into the spotlight as one of the primary faces of our movement, giving interviews and speaking at rallies about the importance of holding corporations accountable for criminal behavior. It was overwhelming and exhausting, but also incredibly empowering to know that our story was inspiring other workers across the country to stand up against similar abuse and exploitation. Every camera flash and every newspaper headline made the company bleed credibility and public trust, while their stock price continued its steady downward spiral as investors fled in panic. With each passing day, more employees from other divisions and other time periods joined our class action lawsuit, swelling our numbers far beyond the original 400 people who had been fired that terrible night. The case was becoming a symbol of something much larger than just our individual grievances. It was becoming a rallying cry for worker justice and corporate accountability. What do you think the company's next desperate move was to try to stop our unstoppable momentum? Share your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're loving this incredible story of justice and revenge. Behind closed doors, the company's board of directors was making increasingly desperate attempts to make this lawsuit disappear before it could destroy everything they had built on the backs of stolen wages. They sent Rachel multiple secret settlement offers, starting with a laughably low $10 million to make this unfortunate misunderstanding go away, and eventually escalating to $50 million when she refused to even consider their initial proposals. But Rachel wasn't interested in quiet settlements that would allow the executives to escape justice while continuing their criminal practices against future employees. "My clients aren't for sale," she told their lawyers in a meeting that became legendary among employment attorneys across the country. "We're going to trial, and we're going to expose every illegal thing your company has done for the past decade." Her refusal to accept hush money sent shockwaves through the corporate world, where most employment disputes were typically resolved with confidential settlements that protected companies from public accountability. For the first time in years, a major corporation was going to face the full consequences of its criminal behavior in open court, where every detail of their wage theft and corruption would be exposed to public scrutiny. The company's stock continued to plummet as word of the failed settlement negotiations leaked to the press, and I could feel the balance of power shifting dramatically in our favor. Then came the discovery that transformed our employment lawsuit into a federal criminal investigation that would ultimately destroy the entire company. After months of painstaking work, Rachel's forensic accountants had been digging deeper into the financial records when they uncovered evidence of systematic securities fraud that went far beyond wage theft and employment violations. The company had been deliberately inflating its revenue numbers and hiding massive debts to make their financial position look stronger to investors and creditors. False quarterly reports, manipulated accounting records, and shell companies designed to hide losses, all of it had been orchestrated by the CFO and personally approved by the CEO as part of a years-long conspiracy to defraud shareholders and lenders. Rachel's face lit up with the kind of fierce joy that defense attorneys have nightmares about when she called to tell us about the discovery. "This isn't just an employment case anymore," she said, her voice filled with barely contained excitement. "We've uncovered evidence of federal securities fraud, and that means the FBI and SEC are going to be very interested in what we've started. Our fight for justice had led us to uncover a criminal conspiracy that threatened to bring federal charges against every executive who had been involved in the cover-up." Months later, after federal agents had spent weeks building their case based on the evidence Rachel's team had shared with them, the FBI raid on company headquarters finally happened at dawn on a Tuesday morning. News helicopters captured every dramatic moment as federal agents in windbreakers carried out box after box of evidence while executives were escorted from the building in handcuffs. The images were broadcast live on every major news network, showing the CEO and CFO doing what lawyers call the perp walk in front of cameras from around the world. Current employees gathered at the windows of nearby buildings to watch their former bosses being loaded into federal vehicles, and many of them were cheering and applauding as they witnessed justice finally being served. The footage of executives who had spent years treating workers like disposable equipment now being treated like the criminals they were sent a wave of vindication through our entire group that was more satisfying than any amount of money could have been. Social media exploded with celebration as people shared the news footage with hashtags like #corporatecriminals and #justice-served. And our story went viral globally as an example of what happens when workers unite to fight back against systematic exploitation. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, it felt like we were finally winning the war instead of just fighting individual battles. But our journey toward justice wasn't going to be easy, and the company's remaining leadership was determined to fight our lawsuit with every dirty trick in their playbook. Their legal team filed dozens of motions to delay the proceedings, dismiss our claims, and discredit our evidence, while also launching a coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation against the key witnesses in our case. Anonymous threatening phone calls started coming to our homes in the middle of the night, mysterious emails appeared in our inboxes warning us to drop the case or face consequences, and several of us found our cars vandalized with notes threatening physical violence if we continued to cooperate with the investigation. One particularly disturbing night, I came home from a strategy meeting with Carmen to find my apartment window broken and a note taped to my door that simply read, "Drop the case or else. We know where you live." My hands were shaking as I called the police, but my resolve only grew stronger because their desperate intimidation tactics proved that we were winning and they knew it. Every threat and every attempt to scare us away from seeking justice only reinforced my determination to see this case through to the bitter end, no matter what personal cost I might have to pay. When the trial finally began after months of legal maneuvering and delay tactics, Rachel absolutely eviscerated the defense with a presentation of evidence that was both methodical and devastating. She projected internal company emails onto giant screens for the jury to read, including the most damning communications where executives had joked about exploiting workers and bragged about getting away with wage theft for years. "We'll save millions this quarter if we just deny the overtime claims and reclassify the full-time workers as contractors," read one email from the CFO to the CEO. "Who's going to stop us? The overworked employees who can't afford lawyers." The gasps and shocked murmurs from the jury box were audible throughout the courtroom as they absorbed the callous cruelty of executives who had viewed their own workers as nothing more than resources to be exploited. Every new piece of evidence painted the same picture over and over again: systematic greed, breathtaking arrogance, and a complete lack of regard for the human beings whose lives and families depended on fair treatment and honest compensation. Even the judge's face grew noticeably tighter and more disapproving with each new revelation of corporate malfeasance, and I could see the defense lawyers growing more desperate as their clients' own words condemned them beyond any possibility of redemption. The company's stock price went into complete free fall during the trial, crashing by 60% in just 2 weeks as investors fled in panic and institutional shareholders dumped millions of shares to avoid further losses. Major clients began canceling contracts and partnerships, unwilling to associate their brands with a company that was facing federal criminal charges and massive civil liability. The corporate headquarters that had once been a symbol of power and success now looked like a sinking ship as employees updated their resumes and started looking for new jobs before the inevitable bankruptcy filing. Financial analysts were openly speculating that our $1.2 billion lawsuit wasn't just a legal problem for the company, it was an execution order that would force them into insolvency even if they somehow managed to avoid criminal convictions. The executives who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable were now scrambling to hire the best criminal defense attorneys they could afford, while also trying to hide their assets from potential seizure by federal authorities. Every day brought new revelations of corruption and new evidence of criminal behavior, and it became clear that the company was facing a complete collapse that would leave nothing but empty offices and bitter memories. Our fight for justice had become something much bigger, a complete dismantling of a criminal enterprise that had masqueraded as a legitimate business for far too long. The most crucial moment in our entire case came during the class certification hearing, where a federal judge would decide whether our lawsuit could proceed as a unified class action or would be split into hundreds of individual cases that would be much easier for the company to fight. If we lost this hearing, our case would be fractured and weakened, allowing the company to pick off individual plaintiffs one by one using their superior financial resources and legal firepower. But if we won class certification, the full combined weight of over 600 employees, our numbers had grown far beyond the original 400, would come down on the company like a legal avalanche. Rachel stood before the federal judge and argued with the kind of passionate intensity that makes law school students dream of becoming trial attorneys, presenting evidence that the company's illegal practices had affected every member of our proposed class in identical ways through systematic wage theft and discrimination. When the judge finally raised her gavel after hours of legal arguments from both sides, the courtroom fell completely silent as everyone waited for the words that would determine our fate. Class action certification is hereby granted, she declared, and the room erupted in cheers and applause from the hundreds of employees who had been waiting months to hear those exact words. We had won the right to fight as one unified force, and the company's chances of survival had just dropped to almost zero. The trial stretched on for weeks as Rachel methodically presented evidence of every crime and every violation the company had committed against its workers over the past decade. Former managers testified about receiving direct orders from executives to falsify time records and deny overtime payments to employees who had legitimately earned them. Company accountants revealed the existence of secret slush funds that had been created using money stolen from worker paychecks and benefits programs. Human resources directors admitted under oath that they had been instructed to find reasons to terminate employees who had complained about illegal practices or who had attempted to organize their co-workers for better treatment. Then came two of our most powerful moments. Jonah took the stand to testify about 12 years of systematic underpayment and watching his colleagues suffer in silence, while Mia's carefully documented evidence was projected onto giant screens for the jury to see the scope of the company's wage theft conspiracy. With every witness who took the stand, the company's legal defense cracked a little bit more, until it became obvious to everyone in the courtroom that we weren't dealing with isolated incidents of poor management but with a systematic criminal conspiracy that had infected every level of the organization. The mounting evidence was so overwhelming that even the company's own lawyers began to look uncomfortable defending their clients' actions, and several defense witnesses actually ended up providing testimony that helped our case rather than hurting it. The climactic moment of the entire trial came when the CEO himself was finally called to testify under oath about his role in the systematic wage theft and securities fraud that had destroyed so many lives. He walked to the witness stand with the kind of arrogant swagger that had probably intimidated employees and competitors for decades, clearly believing he could charm the jury and talk his way out of accountability just like he had done throughout his entire career. For the first hour of his testimony, he spun elaborate stories about difficult business decisions and industry standard practices, trying to portray himself as a visionary leader who had been forced to make tough choices in a competitive marketplace. But then Rachel stepped up to cross-examine him, and her first question cut through his polished facade like a laser beam. "Sir, can you please explain to the jury why your personal signature appears on dozens of documents explicitly approving wage theft and authorizing the falsification of financial reports?" He froze completely, sweat beginning to drip down his forehead as he realized that all of his smooth talk and corporate doublespeak wouldn't save him from his own documented criminal behavior. The jury watched in fascination as this powerful man who had controlled the lives of thousands of employees struggled to find words that might excuse the inexcusable, and his stammering, desperate silence spoke louder than any confession could have. The closing arguments were absolutely brutal to watch, as Rachel painted a comprehensive picture of corporate greed destroying hundreds of lives while the defense lawyers mumbled weak explanations about misunderstandings and industry practices. Rachel's final statement to the jury was a masterpiece of legal persuasion that brought several jurors to tears as she described the human cost of the company's criminal behavior: families who had lost their homes because of stolen wages, employees who had gone without medical care because of illegally denied benefits, and workers who had been blacklisted and intimidated for trying to report crimes they had witnessed. The defense's closing argument was so weak and unconvincing that even they seemed to realize their clients were doomed, and their half-hearted attempt to shift blame and minimize damages only made the executives look more guilty and callous. After nearly a year of legal battles, motions, and hearings, the jury deliberated for less than a full day before returning with a verdict that would make legal history and send shockwaves through corporate boardrooms across the country. When the jury foreman stood up to read their decision, you could have heard a pin drop in that packed courtroom as everyone waited to learn the fate of a company that had built its success on crime and exploitation. Guilty on all counts, he declared in a clear, steady voice. Damages awarded to the plaintiff class, $1.2 billion. The courtroom exploded in cheers, shouts, and applause that lasted for several minutes as 400 people who had been discarded like trash finally received the justice and public vindication they deserved. The company's complete collapse happened with stunning speed once the verdict became public knowledge and the full extent of their financial liability became clear. Bankruptcy filings were submitted within 48 hours as their remaining assets were completely insufficient to pay the massive judgment while also covering their existing debts and operational expenses. Executives who hadn't already been arrested resigned in disgrace and fled to countries without extradition treaties, while their former employees celebrated in the streets outside the courthouse. The gleaming glass headquarters that had once been a symbol of corporate power and success was auctioned off to the highest bidder, along with every other piece of property and equipment the company owned. Current employees who had managed to keep their jobs during the mass layoffs were now facing unemployment as well, but many of them joined our celebration because they had suffered under the same illegal practices and were happy to see justice finally served. The media coverage of the company's downfall was extensive and brutal, with business magazines running cover stories about the billion-dollar collapse and how corporate crime brought down a Fortune 500 giant. We had done something that most people thought was impossible. We had brought down an entire corrupt corporation through the power of unity, determination, and the legal system working exactly as it was supposed to work when crimes are properly exposed and prosecuted. While the company's assets would take months to liquidate through bankruptcy court, we knew that insurance policies, government restitution funds, and asset auctions would eventually fund our settlement. The settlement checks began arriving nearly 2 years later, after bankruptcy court had methodically sorted through the company's remaining assets and allocated funds according to the court's judgment. The process had been complex and frustrating, with payments funded through a combination of asset auctions, insurance payouts from the company's liability policies, and government restitution funds established for victims of corporate fraud. For many of us, the amounts were truly life-changing: enough money to buy homes, start businesses, pay off decades of debt, or simply provide financial security for the first time in our adult lives. Some people used their settlements to fund college educations for their children, others invested in retirement accounts they had never been able to afford, and quite a few started their own businesses based on skills they had developed during their years of being exploited by corporate criminals. But for me personally, the money was never really the point of this entire struggle. It was about the personal closure and emotional healing that came from knowing we had exposed a criminal conspiracy and prevented these executives from victimizing future employees. The knowledge that we had stood up to powerful institutions and won when we had truth and determination on our side was worth more than any financial compensation could ever be. Every time I deposited one of those settlement checks, I thought about all the other workers around the country who were still being exploited by similar companies, and I hoped that our victory would inspire them to fight back against injustice wherever they encountered it. Now, whenever I drive past the empty lot where the company's headquarters used to stand before it was demolished to make room for affordable housing, I remember that terrible night when 400 of us were discarded via email like we were nothing more than unwanted equipment. Sometimes my kids are in the back seat, and I tell them this story. This is where Mommy learned that when people stand together for what's right, they can change everything. But I don't feel bitterness or sadness when I see that empty space. Instead, I feel an overwhelming sense of power and pride in what we accomplished together when we refused to disappear quietly into the night. We were 400 voices that a criminal corporation tried to silence forever, but when we joined together and raised those voices in unison, we shouted so loudly that the whole world had to stop and listen to our story. Our nearly 2-year legal battle didn't just bring down a company that deserved to be destroyed. It proved that no matter how small or powerless you might feel when you're standing alone, there is incredible strength in unity and truth. The executives who tried to steal from us and exploit us learned the hard way that there are consequences for treating human beings like disposable resources, and their downfall serves as a warning to every other corporate criminal who thinks they can get away with systematic abuse. Every time I meet someone who is facing workplace exploitation or corporate abuse, I tell them our story and remind them that justice is possible when people refuse to give up and fight back together against the forces that try to keep them down, even when that fight takes years and demands everything you have. If this incredible story of workers uniting to bring down corporate criminals inspired you, drop a comment below about your own experiences with workplace injustice. Have you ever had to stand up to a powerful employer or corporation? Hit that like button if you believe in the power of ordinary people fighting back against systematic abuse, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping stories of justice, revenge, and people who refuse to let the powerful get away with crimes. Trust me, the stories we have coming next will blow your mind and restore your faith in the possibility of real change when people unite for justice.